The Data and the Deal. Mercer, Bannon, and the Machine behind 2016. In March of 2018, a 28-year-old Canadian data scientist named Christopher Wiley sat down with reporters from The Observer and The New York Times and started talking. Within days, Facebook stock had lost tens of billions of dollars in value. A British political consulting firm most people had never heard of was suddenly front-page news around the world, and two names started showing up everywhere: Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon. Neither man had sought that kind of attention. Mercer, in particular, had spent decades trying to stay invisible. But by the time Wiley finished talking, the outlines of a story were clear. A reclusive hedge fund billionaire, a media provocateur, a small army of data scientists, and 87 million Facebook profiles, all converging on the 2016 American presidential election. This is the story of how that happened, and it starts more than 20 years earlier in a research lab that had nothing to do with politics at all. Chapter 1. The quant Robert Mercer grew up in New Mexico, the kind of kid who taught himself to program on a borrowed IBM computer at a science camp when he was still a teenager. He went on to earn a doctorate in computer science, and in 1972 he joined IBM's Thomas J. Watson Research Center, working alongside a small team trying to teach computers to translate human language using statistics rather than grammar rules. It was obscure, highly technical work. Mercer helped pioneer a technique called Brown clustering, and decades later the field's own professional association gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award for it. In 1993, a Renaissance Technologies executive recruited Mercer to help apply that same statistical pattern-hunting mindset to financial markets instead of language. Renaissance was unusual as hedge funds go. Its founder, a mathematician named James Simons, filled the place with physicists and computer scientists instead of the usual Wall Street types. Mercer thrived there. He and a former IBM colleague, Peter Brown, eventually became co-CEOs, running the firm's Medallion Fund, which quietly became one of the most successful trading operations in the history of finance. By most accounts, Mercer was brilliant, soft-spoken, and almost pathologically private. People who worked with him described a man who avoided small talk and eye contact, who was, by more than one account, more comfortable around his cats than around most people. He was also, it turned out, a serious poker player, a hobby that rewarded exactly the kind of probabilistic thinking he'd built a career on. What made Mercer politically significant wasn't anything he said in public. He almost never gave interviews, but where his money went. Starting in the early 2010s, he and his daughter Rebecca became two of the largest funders of the American right. Breitbart News, the Government Accountability Institute, the Heritage Foundation, groups that promoted skepticism of mainstream climate science. A former employee later told a reporter that Mercer wanted to shrink the federal government down to the size of, in his words, a pinhead. Whether or not that's a precise quote of his underlying philosophy, it captures the direction all that money was flowing, toward deregulation, toward alternative media, toward unsettling institutions Mercer apparently no longer trusted. Mercer had spent his career finding hidden patterns in noisy data and using them to make money nobody thought was there to be made. Around 2013, he decided to see if the same approach might work on voters. Chapter 2, The Provocateur. If Mercer was the money and the mathematics, Steve Bannon was the story he wanted to tell with it. Bannon's own path to politics was almost as unlikely as Mercer's. He served 7 years as a naval officer, then went to Harvard Business School, then landed at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. In 1990, he started his own boutique media finance firm, and in one deal involving the sale of Castle Rock Entertainment, his company came away with a small ownership stake in a handful of television shows, including a still obscure sitcom called Seinfeld. When Seinfeld became one of the most lucrative shows in television history, Bannon's cut of the syndication money gave him the financial independence to reinvent himself again, this time as a Hollywood producer of conservative documentaries. It was at a screening of one of those films, a tribute to Ronald Reagan, that Bannon met Andrew Breitbart, the combative conservative publisher. The two became close, and when Breitbart died suddenly in 2012, Bannon took over as executive chairman of Breitbart News. Under his direction, the site leaned hard into nationalist anti-establishment coverage, and by 2016 Bannon himself was describing it in his own words as the platform for the alt-right. Bannon wanted more than a website, though. He wanted a movement, and a movement needs both a story and an audience to tell it to. Robert Mercer, it turned out, was already trying to build the tool that could find that audience, one voter at a time. Chapter 3. Building the machine. The company that would become Cambridge Analytica started life as an obscure British consultancy called Strategic Communications Laboratories, a firm that had spent years doing psychological influence and messaging work for governments and militaries abroad. Around 2013, Mercer put up an estimated $15 to $20 million to spin off an American arm, taking roughly 90% ownership himself. Bannon, who by some accounts came up with the new company's name, took a board seat and an ownership stake of his own. To run the research side of the operation, the firm hired a young Canadian named Christopher Wiley, a self-taught data scientist in his early 20s who'd previously worked on youth turnout strategy for mainstream progressive parties in Canada and Britain, before this next job pulled him sharply rightward. Wiley's job was to figure out whether personality, not just demographics, could predict how someone would vote, and whether you could shift that vote by speaking to their personality directly. To do that, the firm needed data, a lot of it, and it found a partner in Alexander Kogan, a psychology researcher at Cambridge University. In 2014, Kogan built a Facebook quiz app called This Is Your Digital Life, styled as an academic personality survey. About 270,000 people downloaded it and agreed to share their own data for research purposes. But Facebook's rules at the time let an app like Kogan's also reach into the profiles of each user's friends, harvesting their data too, without those friends ever knowing the app existed. Multiplied across 250,000 initial users, that loophole eventually exposed the data of an estimated 87 million people. Kogan sold that dataset to Cambridge Analytica in violation of Facebook's own academic use rules, and the firm used it to build models scoring individuals across 5 personality dimensions, sometimes called the Big Five, or by the acronym OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The theory was elegant. A fearful voter and a curious voter might hold the exact same policy positions but respond to completely different messages. If you could sort the electorate by psychology instead of just zip code, you could, in theory, speak to each group in the language that moved it most. Whether the theory actually worked as advertised is one of the most disputed parts of this entire story, and we'll come back to that. Chapter 4. The Cruz Experiment. The Mercer's first major test of their new machine wasn't Donald Trump, it was Ted Cruz. Through 2014 and 2015, Cambridge Analytica worked for the Texas Senator's presidential campaign, applying its data models in early states like Iowa. The Mercers had been longtime Cruz backers, and for a while it looked like their political project and their preferred candidate were the same thing. That changed in the spring of 2016, when Cruz's campaign collapsed and Donald Trump emerged as the presumptive Republican nominee. The Mercers now faced a choice: sit out a candidate they hadn't originally backed, or pivot the entire operation, the money, the data firm, and eventually the people, toward Trump instead. They chose to pivot. Chapter 5. The takeover. By the summer of 2016, Trump's campaign was in real trouble. He was trailing badly in the polls, his message was scattershot, and his campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was engulfed in controversy over his past work for pro-Russian political interests in Ukraine. Rebecca Mercer saw an opening. She pushed the campaign to bring in 2 people, pollster Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon. In August of 2016, Manafort resigned, and Bannon was installed as the campaign's chief executive, with Conway as campaign manager, a shake-up widely understood, even at the time, to have been engineered at the Mercers' urging. Around the same moment, the campaign formally brought on Cambridge Analytica as a paid data vendor, eventually paying the firm close to $6 million. It was, in effect, a hostile takeover of a struggling campaign by a single family's political operation, its media arm, its data arm, and now its own people, all in place at once. There was a legal wrinkle in all of this that wouldn't come to light until years later. Campaign finance law requires that a super PAC, an outside spending group, in this case the Mercer-funded Make America No. 1, operate independently of the campaign it supports, with no coordination between the two. But Cambridge Analytica was working for both the super PAC and the campaign at the same time, while Bannon, now the campaign's CEO, remained a Cambridge Analytica board member and simultaneously had his own production company making anti-Clinton ads for that same super PAC. Documents that surfaced later suggested this overlapping arrangement may have crossed the legal line meant to keep those two pools of money and strategy apart. Chapter 6. Dark Posts. So what did Cambridge Analytica actually do once it was inside the campaign? Its core product was executed through Facebook's own advertising system, using something called dark posts, advertisements visible only to the specific person or narrow slice of the audience they were targeted at, never appearing in anyone's public feed. That mattered enormously. A dark post can't be seen by journalists, fact-checkers, or the person's own friends and family. It exists only in the space between the platform and the individual it was built for. Layered on top of that was rapid testing. Thousands of slightly different versions of an ad, run simultaneously, to see which language, imagery, or emotional appeal moved a given audience segment most. Christopher Wiley has said publicly that part of the firm's strategic work was aimed at deepening cultural and racial divisions, and in his telling, discouraging turnout among some groups of voters, while energizing others against Hillary Clinton, claims that Trump campaign officials have pushed back on. It's worth pausing here to note something separate but related happening at the exact same time. Russia's Internet Research Agency was independently running its own disinformation and bot amplification campaign across Facebook and Twitter during the 2016 race. That operation had no connection to Cambridge Analytica. But both were exploiting the same underlying weakness, that a social platform built to connect people could just as easily be used to deliver narrow, unaccountable political messages to exactly the people most likely to be moved by them, with almost no outside visibility into what was being said or to whom. And here's the twist that often gets left out of this story. Despite all the fanfare around Cambridge Analytica's psychographic targeting, people who actually ran the Trump campaign's digital operation later said they'd largely stopped using that specific product before Election Day, judging the personality-based scores unproven, and leaning instead on much more conventional tools: Facebook's standard ad platform and ordinary voter file matching. The firm's most famous product may have generated more headlines than actual votes. Chapter 7, Victory and a Year of Silence. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency. Steve Bannon moved into the White House as chief strategist. Cambridge Analytica, for the moment, receded from view, a footnote in most of the post-election coverage, known mainly to political operatives and campaign finance reporters. That changed in March of 2017, when journalist Jane Mayer published a lengthy profile of Robert Mercer in The New Yorker. It was the first real public reckoning with who Mercer was and what his money had built, the funding network stretching from Breitbart to climate denial think tanks to Cambridge Analytica itself. Mercer still wouldn't talk to reporters directly, but for the first time, the shape of what he'd assembled was visible. Even so, the full story of the data itself, how it had actually been obtained, was still a year away from becoming public. Chapter 8, the whistleblower Christopher Wiley had left Cambridge Analytica years earlier, disillusioned with what the firm was doing with the tools he'd helped build. In March of 2018, he decided to tell the whole story, working with reporters at The Observer, The Guardian, and The New York Times. What Wiley described was staggering in scale. Not the couple 100,000 people who'd knowingly downloaded Kogan's quiz app, but an estimated 87 million Facebook profiles, reached through those users' unwitting friends' networks. He described Cambridge Analytica's internal culture in detail, and Bannon's hands-on role in shaping the company well before the 2016 campaign. He would later say the true number of people affected might be even higher than the 87 million figure Facebook itself eventually confirmed. The fallout was immediate. Facebook's stock dropped sharply within days. A delete Facebook movement spread across social media, no small irony given the subject. In April, Mark Zuckerberg was hauled before Congress to testify. In May, Wiley himself testified before both the UK Parliament and the US Senate Judiciary Committee. Around the same time, undercover footage from Britain's Channel 4 caught Cambridge Analytica's CEO, Alexander Nix, casually discussing the use of bribery and entrapment tactics in elections elsewhere in the world. Nix was suspended within days. By early May of 2018, Cambridge Analytica and its parent company filed for insolvency and shut down for good. The regulatory reckoning stretched on for years afterward. The Federal Trade Commission eventually fined Facebook $5 billion over its data handling failures connected to the episode. British regulators issued their own fine. Lawsuits and settlements continued well beyond that. Chapter 9, What We Still Don't Know. It would be tidy to end the story there, with a villain unmasked and a company shut down. But the honest version of this story has some genuine loose ends, and it's worth sitting with them rather than smoothing them over. The first is effectiveness. Digital micro-targeting wasn't invented by Cambridge Analytica. The Obama campaigns had pioneered heavy use of Facebook data years earlier, to considerable and less controversial effect. Several people who worked closest to the Trump campaign's actual digital operation, along with independent researchers who have studied the episode since, have argued that Cambridge Analytica's psychographic branding oversold what was, underneath the jargon, a fairly conventional marketing analytics product. To date, no rigorous independent study has proven that its specific targeting method changed the outcome of the election. It's entirely possible the company was better at marketing itself than at marketing candidates. The second loose end is motive. The money trail connecting Mercer to Breitbart, to Cambridge Analytica, to the Trump campaign is about as well documented as political financing gets. But why Mercer wanted all of this, his interior reasoning, his actual theory of what America needed, is something almost entirely inferred by journalists from his associates and his spending, because the man himself essentially never explained it in his own words. That's worth remembering before treating any account of his motives, including this one, as settled fact. What isn't in dispute is simpler, and in some ways more important than either of those questions. Personal data belonging to tens of millions of people was obtained without their knowledge or consent, and used to try to influence how they thought and voted, largely out of public view. Whether or not it swung the outcome, it exposed something true and lasting about the platforms all of us still use every day, that they can be quietly turned into instruments of persuasion, aimed with precision, and almost invisible to the people on the receiving end. That vulnerability didn't disappear when Cambridge Analytica closed its doors in 2018. The company was shut down. The underlying opportunity it tried to exploit largely was not.